Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is April 23rd. This day in 2018 marked a major breakthrough in some of the most notorious unsolved cases in California history. After decades of fear and heartbreak, authorities finally announced that they had identified the Golden State Killer. And they did it using something that few people expected: DNA and a public genealogy website. This wasn't just a victory for victims and investigators, it changed the future of criminal investigations forever. Let's get into it. To understand how monumental this moment was, we need to go way back. Because for over a decade, from 1974 through 1986, California was terrorized by a violent and methodical predator who seemed to vanish into thin air after each crime. At first, no one realized that all these crimes were connected. The attack started in Visalia, where he was dubbed the Visalia Ransacker. He broke into homes, over 100 of them, stealing odd items, rifling through personal belongings, sometimes even returning to hit the same neighborhood. Now, people at first just thought this was a bold and kind of weird burglar, until the break-ins started escalating. In 1976, the Sacramento area was hit by a new nightmare: the East Area Rapist. He wore a ski mask, carried a gun or knife, and struck late at night. He stalked his victims beforehand, watching their homes, learning their schedules. He would blind them with a flashlight, tie them up with shoelaces or items from their own homes, and sexually assault them. He would even taunt his victims with phone calls, sometimes before the attack and sometimes months later. Over the next 2 years, he committed at least 50 rapes across 6 counties in Northern California. Then suddenly, he vanished. And then Southern California started to see a new wave of terror. Starting in 1979, couples began turning up dead, murdered while sleeping in bed. The killer used blunt force or firearms. And it wasn't until later that these crimes were linked to the East Area Rapist. Authorities then gave him a new name: the original Night Stalker. But eventually, a more unified name took hold: the Golden State Killer. This name reflected the sheer scale of his crimes all across California. By the early 2000s, DNA evidence confirmed what many suspected. The Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, and the Golden State Killer were all the same man. One man, one monster. He was responsible for over 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, and over 120 burglaries, before disappearing without a trace in 1986. Some of his victims were just starting their lives. Others, like 18-year-old Janelle Cruz, were murdered in their own homes. There was Brian and Katie Maggiore, who were gunned down while walking their dog. Lyman and Charlene Smith, who were bludgeoned to death in bed. Each story was devastating, and each left a family searching for justice that never came. For more than 40 years, police tried to solve this case. They followed thousands of leads. They collected hundreds of DNA samples. They conducted stakeouts and compiled case files that were taller than most desks. But still, nothing. Then, the break finally came with a new and at the time controversial technique: genetic genealogy. In 2018, Sacramento County investigator Paul Holes, along with genealogist Barbara Ray Venter and an FBI team, uploaded a DNA profile from a crime scene to GEDmatch, a public genealogy website. They weren't looking for a direct hit. They were hoping to find a distant relative, a cousin, a second cousin, something like that, whose DNA might point them to the killer's family tree. And it worked. Over several weeks, Ray Venter carefully mapped out generations of a family tree, slowly narrowing it down to one person: Joseph James DeAngelo. Born in 1945, DeAngelo was a former police officer with a military background. He had served in the Navy, earned a degree in criminal justice, and worked for law enforcement in 2 California towns, one of which happened to be Visalia, where the ransacker had been active. He had no serious criminal record, and he'd quietly built a life in the Sacramento suburbs. He'd gotten married, had kids, and worked as a mechanic. No one suspected that the friendly, slightly odd neighbor was one of the most prolific serial predators in American history. In April 2018, detectives began surveillance. They recovered discarded DNA from DeAngelo's trash, specifically a tissue, and it was a match. On April 23rd, a warrant was issued. The next day, Joseph James DeAngelo, then 72 years old, was arrested outside of his home. After decades of hiding in plain sight, he was finally caught. The courtroom journey that followed was in some ways as groundbreaking as the arrest itself. Because of the statute of limitations, DeAngelo couldn't be charged with many of the rapes and burglaries. But murder has no statute of limitations. Prosecutors charged him with 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping. The charges spanned 6 counties, and with so many jurisdictions involved, the case was centralized in Sacramento for a unified legal process. Victims and survivors from all over the state waited to see what would come next. Rather than face the death penalty and a long drawn-out trial, DeAngelo agreed to a plea deal. On June 29, 2020, in a socially distanced courtroom set up in Sacramento Ballroom, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 murders and admitted to dozens of other crimes, including uncharged rapes. It wasn't just legal closure, it was emotional. Survivors and families of the victims packed the courtroom. Some cried, some glared at the man who had destroyed their lives. And when the time came to speak, they made sure their voices were heard. During sentencing in August 2020, over 36 people gave victim impact statements, sharing decades of pain, loss, and fear. One woman said she still slept with a knife by her bed. Another told DeAngelo that he had stolen her childhood. When it was finally DeAngelo's turn to speak, he stood, removed his mask, and said in a quiet, flat voice, quote, "I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to anyone I've hurt," end quote. For many, it wasn't nearly enough. The judge sentenced DeAngelo to 11 consecutive life sentences without parole, plus an additional life sentence and 8 more years, ensuring he would die behind bars. The Golden State Killer's capture closed one of the most terrifying chapters in American crime history, but it also opened new doors. The technique that helped identify DeAngelo, genetic genealogy, has since been used to solve over 100 cold cases, from long unsolved murders to decades-old rapes. It's become a powerful tool, combining modern science with traditional detective work. And we've talked about several of these cases on this podcast already this year. But it hasn't come without controversy. Critics have raised concerns about privacy and consent. Should your distant cousin's DNA lead to your arrest? What if you've never uploaded anything, but they have? In response, many genealogy sites have updated their policies, requiring users to opt in to law enforcement access. The debate continues, but so does the progress. And just as a side note, if you are interested in having your DNA available for investigations like this, you can actually take the data from, your 23andMe, your Ancestry, wherever you've done your kit, and upload it to GEDmatch directly, and law enforcement will have access to it that way. Obviously, that's something that's completely voluntary because you have to take the steps to do it yourself. But it is something that I did, for instance, right after I took my test. Because, listen, if I've got some shady second cousin out there, I'm fine with it. As for DeAngelo, he's still serving his time in California's high-security Corcoran State Prison. He never offered a full confession. He never explained why. But his courtroom admissions and the DNA left no doubt. The survivors, they're still healing. Some have become advocates. Some have stepped back into their private life. But they now carry something that many thought they would never see: resolution. And of course, we can't talk about the Golden State Killer without mentioning Michelle McNamara, the true crime author whose book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, reignited public interest in this case. Though she sadly passed away before DeAngelo's arrest, her work was instrumental and her dedication lives on to those she inspired. The identification and arrest of the Golden State Killer wasn't just a breakthrough, it was a turning point. It proved that even the coldest cases can still be cracked open. It showed the power of science, the resilience of survivors, and the importance of never giving up on justice. Joseph DeAngelo thought he'd gotten away with it, and for decades, he did. But on April 23rd, 2018, that illusion shattered. And it ushered in a whole new wave of crime solving. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!